Let me introduce Professor Frelik at this point. Okay, so she is assistant professor in the Department of British and American Studies at Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin, and she teaches classes in American art, history, popular culture, mass media, and film. In 2013, she won a prestigious award from the Terra Foundation for American Art for the international essay on Ad Reinhardt, painter as writer. And then she was invited, as part of the award, she was invited to lecture at the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And her essay was published in the fall 2014 issue of the Smithsonian Journal American Art. She was also invited by art critic and historian Barbara Rose to contribute an essay on reading Ad Reinhardt in Poland. And Barbara Rose, she is very famous. She's one of the absolutely top leading art critics in the United States. And this essay was published in the Brooklyn Rail magazine in December 2013. Then in 2015, she collaborated with Professor Jerzy Kutnik, and they organized an international conference on American artists as readers, writers, and literati. In 2016, she published a book on Thomas Hart Benton, Marston Hartley, and Ad Reinhardt as writers. And she was also invited to contribute to a catalog which went with the first European retrospective exhibition of Hartley's work, and that happened in Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark. So, as you can see, she is an extremely prolific and also, recognized scholar. And today, in a moment, we'll have a pleasure of listening to her. Okay, so Edyta, the floor is yours. Welcome to this event, and please, we may begin.
Thank you so much, Justyna and Anya. Thank you for having me here. So let me prepare my presentation. Okay. Just let me know if you can see it. Okay.
Yes, it's good.
Let's start immediately. I have a lot to say today. Okay. A few weeks ago, renowned art critic and Pulitzer Prize winner Jerry Saltz tweeted on the differences between making art and making art criticism. And here's what he wrote. A good critic always puts more into writing about artwork than the artist put into making it. The artist only creates. The critic must plumb that creation and also write creatively enough to deliver the full volume of the art, while also creating a thing of beauty and clarity itself. And almost immediately, Saltz's name began trending on Twitter with users, including many artists, engaging in a heated debate, mostly expressing their indignation at the critic's words. Soon the gossip column of the New York Post joined in the castigation of Saltz for his bombastic announcement. The critic quickly apologized, calling his post a monumental tweet gaff, a dim-witted deed, and a galactically big error in judgment and word choice. But also, in an act of self-exculpation, he referred his readers to Oscar Wilde's 1891 essay, The Critic as Artist, in which the Irishman placed critical contemplation over artistic creation. Both Wilde's distinction between thought and action and Solz's juxtaposition of making judgments and making art call up the old age notion that artists belong more with artisans and craftsmen rather than thinkers and inventors, because all they need to produce aesthetically pleasing objects are manual skills and sensual acumen, not intellect. But in the United States, acceptation of the stratification of professions and trades implied here is confounded by a sentiment which has always been present in American society. Its roots and manifestations were for the first time systematically described and explained by Richard Hofstadter in his seminal study, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, published in 1963, in which the historian traced the history of the national disrespect for mind. And he made these two key discoveries here. One, anti-intellectualism is a perennial phenomenon that fluctuates in cycles in response to various social upheavals and transformations. And two, it cannot just be reduced to a clash between different worldviews and systems of values as reflective of levels of education and knowledge of different segments of the population. As a kind of frame of mind, it crosses and blurs the alleged fault line separating so-called simple people from so-called cultivated ones, Hofstadter's words. Anti-intellectualism, Hofstadter shows, pervades American political, religious, business, educational, and cultural institutions and ideologies, and as such, it is fully consonant with the view that egalitarianism is one of the most important keystones on which American democracy rests. The common strain that binds together the attitudes and ideas which Hofstadter calls anti-intellectual is a resentment and suspicion of the life of the mind and of those who are considered to represent it, and a disposition constantly to minimize the value of that life. So this is these are Hofstadter's words. Crucially, since neither education nor socioeconomic status automatically determines how people view the merits and virtues, or conversely, the perils and vices of the life of the mind, we can find at any given period countless examples of anti-intellectual bias among prominent politicians, business people, clergy, journalists, writers, educators, scholars, and tellingly also artists. And although my proper focus is on American art and artists, I can't resist invoking here the popular French phrase, bête comme un peintre, meaning dumb as a painter, stupid as a painter. And Matisse's famous dictum that whoever wishes to devote himself, should be herself, to painting should begin by cutting off his own tongue. For thinking and talking diminishes and may even destroy what the paintbrush conveys best. The French modernist disparagement of words and ideas may seem surprisingly old-fashioned, but it only shows how deeply rooted the old view that conceptualization, pre-conceptualization, reasoning and logical thinking are a part of the creative process only to a degree. And still, this was the case when modernist revolution began, which I'll be focusing on later. We must remember in this connection that the American context is significantly and uniquely different from that of the Old World, meaning Western Europe, because of the country's history. In the predominantly Protestant colonies, especially in Puritan New England, there simply was no justification for artistic pursuits. Because early settlers had no time for the arts, they were not promoted. There were no art schools, no art teachers, no recognized masters, no institutional or private collections of works of art. After all, Puritans were people of the word, not the image. They did not even approve of religious art. If art and artists were to be accepted into society, they had to have a useful, practical function. Hence, the first art form that developed in the colonies was portraiture, because portraits were treated as a medium for commemorating persons of distinction for future generations, a testimony of their high social standing and accomplishments, especially in business. The early portraitists, so-called limners, were mostly anonymous, self-taught craftsmen who traveled the countryside, painting signs for merchants and portraits of family members of wealthy local patrons. In Boston, one artist, John Singleton Copley, rose to prominence not only due to his outstanding talent, but also through his association with the city's business elite. Eventually, he was claimed by England, like another famous compatriot, Benjamin Franklin, who became the king's favorite, and later in life, the president of the Royal Academy in London. And many aspiring American artists flocked to London, where they benefited from West's instruction and mentorship, the kind of patronage not available at home until after the revolution. The perception and social standing of artists began to change with the advancement by the founding fathers of their vision of the sciences and liberal and fine arts as the foundation of an enlightened democratic nation. Benjamin Franklin insisted as early as 1743 that after, quote, the first drudgery of settling new colonies was over, it was time to afford leisure to cultivate the finer arts and improve the common stock of knowledge, end of quote. And in 1770, John Trumbull, a cousin of the painter by the same name, made a similar plea for the importance and value of music, art, and literature, predicting that America has a fair prospect in a few centuries of ruling both in arts and arms. In the young republic, its most prominent artists elevated themselves and their art largely through their association with leading public figures. John Trumbull and Charles Willson Peale were both soldiers in George Washington's Continental Army and became personal friends of the first president. Gilbert Stewart became the most celebrated portraitist of the federal period by painting the Republic's first 6 presidents, and his most famous work, an unfinished portrait of Washington, has been reproduced on several postage stamps. You might know it from the $1 bill. Notably, quite a few painters treated their art as just one of their numerous pursuits. Peale, for instance, collected specimens of animals and plants from around the world and displayed them in what is considered the American precursor of the Natural History Museum. Interestingly, he not only included his own historical paintings in the exposition, but also, to heighten viewers' interest, added some rather bizarre exhibits, such as a notorious murderer's finger and a stuffed deformed calf. Samuel B. Morse, who studied philosophy, mathematics, and science of horses before establishing himself as a successful portraitist, so disappointed with Americans' low regard for artists that he stopped painting and switched back to his interest in science and technology. He experimented with the daguerreotype, an early form of photography, but is mostly known today, of course, as the inventor of the Morse code, which was adopted by as the international standard in telegraph communication. In the course of the 19th century, many artists engaged in extra artistic activities and associated themselves with writers, scientists, and scholars to bolster their reputation as peers of those constituting the political and intellectual elites. During and after the revolution, they fulfilled the demand for patriotic uplift by depicting politicians and glorious moments from the nation's short history. Many enjoyed a status equal to that of the Republic's leaders through their work and ideas, fostering democratic virtues and elevating society as the founding fathers had envisioned. Yet, despite the felicitous fusion of political, intellectual, and artistic concerns during the federal era, the period was also marked by doubt, self-doubt, reservation, and skepticism, as political, social, economic, and cultural developments sometimes deflected the course of American democracy. When Andrew Jackson's populist vision captured the imagination of millions, one of the strongest responses to the threat of the erosion of the Jeffersonian Republican idea came from an artist, the painter Thomas Cole, who in his cycle, The Course of Empire, warned Americans about the hazards of populist demagoguery and mob rule. But it is a telling irony that while Jackson's Democratic Party eventually evolved into a liberal progressive force that successfully garnered the support of the educated middle class for democratic reforms, Cole went down in history as a champion of elitist ideals that were at odds with the democratic spirit. The roots of this paradox can be found in the ambivalent attitude toward art of Jefferson himself. Jefferson was the most aesthetic-oriented of the founding fathers. Though steeped in the culture of France, he sensed that a lot of its great art represented the aristocracy's propensity for luxury, and as such was intrinsically insidious and therefore at odds with the noble ideal of a virtuous state that America aspired to. Characteristically, in a letter recommending objects of attention to two young Americans embarking on a grand tour of Europe, Jefferson wrote that unlike the old world's architecture, agriculture, gardens, mechanical arts, and politics, painting and sculpture, quote, are worth seeing, but not studying, end of quote. Characteristically, too, his reasons were pragmatic rather than aesthetic. He wrote, too expensive for the state of wealth among us, it would be useless, therefore, and preposterous for us to endeavor to make ourselves connoisseurs in those arts. While, despite Jefferson's skepticism, connoisseurship and learnedness were natural goals for cultivated Americans like writers, philosophers, scholars, scientists, and artists, for the average person, democratic aspirations were rather synonymous with acquiring useful knowledge, developing practical science, and providing equal educational opportunity. But as Cole's famous peer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, they were born only 2 years apart at the outset of the 19th century, warned, it was a mistake to assume that reason and understanding were the bulwarks against ignorance and intellectual laxness. In his essay, American Scholar, he launched a broad attack on the American mindset in general, leveling charges of anti-intellectualism, not just against the, quote, sluggish and perverted mind of the multitude, end of quote, but more significantly, also against those in the business of thinking, the society's delegated intellect, whom he castigated for not being able to think right. Emerson's words of wisdom, however, fell on deaf ears as America entered its Gilded Age, an era during which relentless pursuit of material security and comfort, now available to unprecedented numbers of enterprising individuals, resulted in commodification of knowledge and culture. As the masses, now less often literary hungry for food and more for their share of America's acres of diamonds, embraced social Darwinism and the attendant rags to riches mythology, post-bellum political, business, and intellectual elites transformed the country into what Edwin Lawrence Godkin, founder of The Nation, and The Nation is America's oldest continuously published weekly magazine, called chromo-civilization. Its homegrown intellectuals, he argued, are a product of a pseudo-culture nurtured by popular educational institutions and the proliferating print media, which give people a false sense of easy access to spiritual and moral depths, and especially to knowledge, now understood chiefly as accumulation of facts. The vulgarization of values and ideas, treated as commodities, like material goods obtainable if only you have the money to pay for them, alarmed a group of high-minded politicians, journalists, and writers known as the Magwamps. Magwamps, an Indian word meaning war leader. Its members, among them were Mark Twain, William James, and Charles Eliot Norton, a professor of art history at Harvard, initiated a public campaign aimed at exposing the dire consequences of the ongoing depletion of the American mind, an eclipse of higher intellectual and ethical standards, by cultural conceits which were an odd combination of modern go-getter mentality and backwardness and parochialism, epitomized by the era's thinly gilded ethos of Victorian bourgeoisie. The intrinsic incongruities and contradictions of this ethos were bound to result in conflicts and clashes, and in casualties. A classic example of which is what happened to one of the most important painters of the era, Thomas Aikens, a professor of art at the Pennsylvania Academy. A liberal thinker who approached art and art teaching with a scientific mind, he created a unique collective portrait of late 19th century American intelligentsia by painting many of his academic colleagues and close friends, a circle that included professional men, scientists, doctors, writers, military officers, clergy, and sportsmen, and artistically minded women, painters, singers, actresses, photographers. Aikens always presented them caught in the act of thinking and or executing their art. His pragmatic understanding of craftsmanship was quintessentially American. To bring out in the most complete fashion the expressivity of his sitters' physique, both their full figures and their faces, especially their eyes, he deemed it absolutely essential to learn and then to accurately teach all the secrets of human body. That is why he attended anatomy classes at Jefferson Medical College to better instruct his students during live figure drawing lessons. His use of both male and female nude models in coeducational classes made him a controversial figure, just as did his compulsion for medical accuracy. When he submitted his monumental masterpiece, The Gross Clinic, to the art exhibition at Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition in 1876, the hanging committee rejected it as too graphic, gross even. Perhaps not so ironically, Aikens's artistry received due recognition from his medical colleagues, who displayed the painting in the US hospital building at the exposition. So not art building, but the hospital building. Today, the work is regarded as one of the greatest American paintings, but in the Victorian era, it was unacceptably bold and crude, as was Aikens's conduct as an educator. The artist was ousted from his position at the Academy, and his reputation was tarnished for the rest of his life. In the eyes of many, Aikens's alleged amorality disqualified him because it stood in opposition to the popular understanding of the role of art and artists in society. The Crayon magazine defined it in this way: art ought to be morally and spiritually uplifting, therapeutic, a bit like religion. And in this scheme of things, the artist should be a reformer, a philanthropist, full of hope and reverence and love. As elsewhere, upheavals brought down empires, resulting in a world war. In the US, progressivism brought crucial economic, social, and political reforms that saved American democracy and American capitalism. It might seem that that also created perfect conditions for the vindication of intellect, knowledge, and expertise, and that artists would quite naturally benefit from the widespread support for progressivist ideas and actions. Ironically, however, a number of new theories appeared around that time that frustrated such expectations. One example, promulgated by the pseudoscience of physiognomy, which claimed to be able to relate external physical features to one's character. Physiognomists relegated artistic types to a category distinctly different from that reserved for men of reason and intellect. According to them, nearly all artists are rather small and delicately built, and have large, wide open eyes with arched brows, small bones at the joints, and slender fingers. Not noted for the high grade of practicality and reason found in scientists or businessmen, they are described as possessing large heads, which are perforce pear-shaped. Notice, writes one author, how small the neck, how refined the features. This face means delicacy of constitution, heart trouble, nervous indigestion. The brain is too heavy for the body. So now a brief interlude. Take a look at these physiognomies and try to guess which of these men are artists, according to that pseudoscience of physiognomy. Of course, all of them are artists. Such theories are so easily dismissible. But surprising as it may be, they continue to reverberate throughout much of the 20th century, for instance, in eugenics or other overtly racist ideologies. And even today, with face recognition systems developed for purposes of consumer marketing, physiognomy research is not entirely a thing of the past, I'm afraid. Despite such pseudoscientific assertions, the rise of the United States to the status of the leading nation in the modern world also boosted the confidence of those American artists who wanted to be seen as active contributors to the progress that economic prosperity and political and social stability made possible. So I want to focus on the example of the artists, writers, and thinkers associated with photographer and promoter Alfred Stieglitz, because it shows outstandingly how the conflation of conducive circumstances spurred creative personalities to venture into new regions, not only in the field of art, but also outside it. This is the Stieglitz circle, which included not only visual artists, notably Marsden Hartley, John Marin, Paul Strand, Arthur Duff, Charles Demuth, Max Weber, and Georgia O'Keeffe, but also recognized literary figures such as Waldo Frank, Paul Rosenfeld, and William Carlos Williams, with Gertrude Stein acting as the most important external center of authority in matters both literary and artistic. Although stylistically diverse, the art of the group's members was characterized by a peculiar unity of vision, which combined the cosmopolitanism of the modernist avant-garde with a genuinely American sense of modernity. It's grounding both in the ideas of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, and in turn of the century progressivism. The significance of literature and writers was central in the Stieglitz circle, especially the role and place of Williams, who always emphasized the affinities between painting and poetry, comparing the blank page to the blank canvas, poems to pictures, and the activity of writing to that of painting. Stieglitz not only sponsored European sojourns of members of his circle, but also created an American outlet for the most advanced ideas originating in Paris and Berlin, and his 291 gallery showcased the European avant-garde, giving the American public the opportunity to see works of Rodin, Cézanne, Matisse, Rousseau, Picabia, Brancusi, and Picasso. And Stieglitz's journal Camera Work, originally dedicated primarily to promoting photography as an art, offered its pages to both established and aspiring authors. Among the contributors were George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, John Galsworthy, and Gertrude Stein. In fact, her first publication in the United States appeared in Camera Work. Most of the artists promoted by Stieglitz were also given by him the opportunity to expand their ideas in essays, manifestos, reviews, and interviews, as well as pieces of creative writing. The emergence within the circle of a sense that they were collectively participating in the creation of a new aesthetics and new cultural identity came through particularly clearly in the writings of Hartley and Marin, who were not only Stieglitz's most original painters, but were also the most prolific and accomplished poets and essayists in the group. Yet, the recognition of their literary talents and their broadly intellectual ambitions and capabilities was often hindered by various circumstances, many of them having to do with persistent mores and invidious attitudes cultivated in the society at large, but also, quite unsurprisingly, within the art world itself. After all, like American academia at the outset of the 20th century, art was still predominantly a domain of white Anglo-Saxon males. Marin, who unlike many of his colleagues was a member of this privileged category, like others was angered by the platitudes of those who write upon things about which they sense mighty little. Quite cleverly, he turned the abiding artist and artisan stereotype to his advantage, thus justifying his decision to speak out. The worker is one rather given to observing, thinking, and doing. It's not easy for him to talk about and explain his work. But as he and his work have been placed in false position many times, I suppose that he owes it to himself and his world to say something. It is for anyone to determine when, or whether at all, Marin's world became ready for what he had to say. But the fact is that when in 1948, Look magazine declared him America's greatest artist, his accomplishments as a writer were not highlighted. His paintings were sufficient evidence of his mastery. Similarly, it's utterly beside the point whether such pronouncements have any value and validity. Think about this. The following year, Life magazine outdid Look by asking if the title should be given to Jackson Pollock. 42 years Marin's junior, his only claim to fame at the time was his inimitable style of painting that had earned him the nickname Jack the Dripper. Ironically too, while Marin was by many considered a direct influence on abstract expressionism personified by Pollock, the two were poles apart in terms of lineage, upbringing, training, temperament, and cultivation. Unlike Marin, Pollock was the epitome of the inarticulate artist, a dejected introvert who didn't even try to look for words to express his tortured thoughts, and who could explode with anti-intellectual rantings when challenged to speak. But a different kind of disparity is more to the point in the present context. To return to Stiglitz, while he was a generous mentor and promoter, he was not indiscriminate in dispensing attention and favors. Only two of his protégés enjoyed his unflinching and unconditional support from day one. They were John Marin and Georgia O'Keeffe, Stiglitz's lover and then his wife. Regarding Marin, we know from his own testimony that Stiglitz never charged any commission for showing and taking care of his work and didn't try to influence his artistic decisions in any way. Notably too, he not only selflessly organized annual shows of his art, but approved of his writing endeavors. He published a volume of Marin's letters to him and included his occasional writings in exhibition catalogs. Directly or indirectly, he also inspired Dorothy Norman, who was a wealthy arts patron, his devotee and paramour, to collect Marin's writings and have them published. And O'Keeffe, the sole woman in the stable, she was from the beginning aggressively promoted by Stiglitz in his own way as a perfect embodiment of the ideal modern woman artist. Because he was convinced that American modernism, invented and dominated by men, needed a female icon, he made sure she was perceived as a painter bound to her gender, sexuality, and body. In an essay written in 1919, he declared, "Woman feels the world differently than man feels it. and one of the chief generating forces crystallizing into art is undoubtedly elemental feeling. Women's and men's are differentiated through the difference in their sex makeup. The woman receives the world through her womb. That is the seat of her deepest feeling. Mind comes second. Much of this perception was fostered by how Stiglitz presented O'Keeffe in his photographs. So, for instance, in his 1921 retrospective, he devoted a separate section to her at a time when her career as a painter was only beginning. That's important, that was at the very beginning of her career. Titled simply A Woman, the collection of 45 photographs presented a composite portrait in which various parts of O'Keeffe's body, hands, feet, breasts, torso, were abstracted and isolated in thematic clusters, all exuding eroticism, which transgressed Victorian norms of propriety. Gazing with wonder and innocence, she looked at once sexually liberated and poised, mysterious and ostentatious, solemn and provocative. But whose gaze is recorded in these pictures? Stiglitz's or hers? Or do we have a case of collusion here? We know that the couple treated these photographs as a collaborative effort. And the photographer's cumbersome working methods, such as very long exposures, required from O'Keeffe patient endurance, which she willingly offered as she was eager to please him with her demeanor, like she did with her art. But gradually, she came to realize that the image the camera projected cast a long shadow on her art, particularly in those photographs which use her paintings as the backdrop. Stiglitz thus directed the viewer to assume that her art sprang out of her body, or, as Marsden Hartley put it poetically, or perhaps unpoetically, that in her pictures, one encounters the world of a woman turned inside out. Excuse me. And the art dealer Samuel Kutz summed it all up even more bluntly by saying that O'Keeffe was a woman and only secondarily an artist. So publicly, O'Keeffe feigned indifference, but her patience with the men, as she called them, gradually eroded. In a letter to a friend, she was quite explicit about how she felt. I wonder if man has ever been written down the way he has written woman down. I rather feel that he hasn't been. That some woman still has the job to perform. And I wonder if she will ever get at it. I hope so. Yet, having witnessed daily how her male colleagues, as one critic put it, wielded their pens, quote, with ferocity and with faith that words could change the world, unquote, she chose to keep a low profile and bide her time before she was ready to stake her ground. She mostly recorded her thoughts and reflections in letters to several friends, both female and male, but the bulk of her correspondence was with Stiglitz. Between 1915 and 1946, they exchanged over 5,000 letters, and somebody counted that amounts to over 25,000 pages. Imagine that. These letters add up to a psychological self-portrait, which is stark and candid, and yet sophisticated and stylish. Its narrative texture reveals how O'Keeffe's personality evolves through the complex processes of introspection, intellection, and articulation, life writing in the raw that is natural, honest, and resplendent. Unlike with Marin, Stiglitz didn't take much action on this rich epistolary crop, perhaps because he thought it too private or intimate, though it is well known that he had the habit of reading aloud letters he received to those who happened to be around. But he only published a few of O'Keeffe's in one of her exhibition catalogs. And only after his death, she had hundreds of their letters transcribed and filed as documents worth preserving for posterity. One of the things she notes while reading, one notes while reading her letters is that in contrast to the affected verbosity of her male peers, including Stiglitz himself, her diction is simple and unadorned, free of hyperbole, coming across as unrefined, casual, and matter of fact. but that doesn't make the letters any less informative, precise, or vibrant. Combined with the absence of superfluous detail, the apparent artlessness has a parallel in her paintings, in which she tried to get at and bring out the simple, unadorned essence of things, and through minimal means achieve maximum expressive power. The picture of O'Keeffe that emerges from her words is that of a person that is alert, witty, and playful, smart, upfront, and pragmatic, quite unlike the untutored child and unconscious woman that Stiglitz first saw in her. But the verbal self-portrait by which she really wanted to be remembered is a short text she finally agreed to write after years of rejecting such requests. She was 89 then. Her autobiographical narrative is truly a hybrid which eludes classification, if only for the reason that there is no telling whether the reproductions that accompany it are made to complement the text or the other way around. The two simply coexist within the unpaginated spaces enclosed by the album's covers in a relationship that is dialogical and open-ended. It's an artist's book, really. Declaring at the outset that where I was born and where and how I have lived is unimportant, she instantly directs the reader's attention away from the hard facts of her life and towards, as she puts it, how my paintings happen. Dispensing with the conventional autobiographical practice of including photographs, she strips the story of detailed factual content and visual documentation to help foreground her art. She describes her life only in relation to her work and her artistic development, so she doesn't even mention the fact that she was married to Stiglitz in her autobiography. Among the most captivating moments are those when she reflects on the very nature of the relation between her paintings and the words they provoke. And already in the opening paragraph explaining the book's raison d'etre, she says, I write this because such odd things have been done about me with words. I have often been told what to paint. I am often amazed at the spoken and written word telling me what I have painted. I make this effort because no one else can know how my paintings happen. So without referring directly to the interpretations of her early abstractions and flower paintings in terms of the primal and erotic associations allegedly triggered in viewers, she offers insights not only about how she inscribed herself into her images, but also about crucial theoretical matters, such as the relation between objectivism, here synonymous with figuration, representation, realism, and abstraction in art. She writes, objective painting is not good painting unless it is good in the abstract sense. A hill or a tree cannot make a good painting just because it's a hill or a tree. It is lines and colors put together so that they can say something. Or nothing is less real than realism. Details are confusing. It's only by selection, by elimination, by emphasis that we get the real meaning of things. A more succinct and to the point definition of the modern idea could hardly be imagined. Passages such as these prove that she had a reflective mind and was capable of articulating her thoughts with precision and clarity. Many of her colleagues would have been quite surprised, but they were no longer there to read her words. She outlived all of them by several decades, dying at the age of 99 in 1986. And it was then that one of the best kept secrets of her home in Abiquiu, New Mexico, was revealed. Her book room, a collection of over 3,000 volumes of poetry, fiction, philosophy, history, art criticism, many first editions and author-signed copies. During her long life, O'Keeffe felt no need to showcase her learnedness and sometimes even pretended to be quite illiterate, O'Keeffe's words, thus giving credence to the opinion that, as Marsden Hartley put it, she laid no claim to intellectualism. But she didn't always succeed in masking the truth. One of her friends, the Black writer Jean Toomer, once observed in a letter to Stiglitz that his wife liked to pretend she hasn't a mind. I don't think she thinks she fools me, he added. O'Keeffe probably didn't fool Stiglitz either, but he was too committed to his vision of her as a true intuitive genius, innocent and guileless, to acknowledge that her paintings and writings showed the vision that was neither accurate nor discerning. Fear of stigmatization and wanderlust were two of several existential anxieties that prevented Marsden Hartley, a gay man of small-town working-class origins, from securely settling into the position of the most daring, original, and complete modern artist in America, a status he aspired to and possibly deserved, but never achieved despite his recognized accomplishments. Hartley's literary output was voluminous, ambitious, and varied. All his life he wrote on art, literature, aesthetics, philosophy, and other matters, and he composed poems. Earnest but insecure, he constantly craved others' encouragement and support, relying especially on Stiglitz's generosity. Stiglitz did not openly enthuse about Hartley's literary endeavors, his reserve consistent with his declared belief that words may stand in the way of visual expression. He once said that if the artist could describe in words what he does, then he would never have created it. But the painter's output kept growing at a relentless pace. However, major collections of his essays, poetry, letters, and autobiographical writings would only appear decades after his death. His voluminous unpublished works are yet to see the light of day, edited, annotated, and interpreted. Many of them are still in the archives. Despite Gertrude Stein's indifference towards Hartley's poetry, he persevered in his quest for perfect communication of his feelings and thoughts, yo-yoing between fulfillment and doubt, rarely finding repose from vexations and frustrations his artistic odyssey continuously engendered. From his earliest days, he was puzzled by the exact nature of the interaction of imagination, intellect, and experience, and struggled, brush or pen in hand, to see if the heart and the mind could be removed from words, and how such separation might affect his ability to process his experience in the world, which he found both ravaging and ravishing, being caught between the exigency of hiding his sexual orientation and the desire to inscribe it in his works by means of some decipherable code. Having discovered during his first stay in Europe in 1913 the power of mystical experience, after returning to America, he fell under the spell of William James's thought after reading the varieties of religious experience, especially the idea that the experience of spiritual elevation and mystical union with God, what is called transport, transference, or rapture, is essentially incommunicable or inexpressible. Considering himself a man of action, predestined to unremittingly face life's perverse and oblique challenges against all odds, Hartley boldly, and sometimes desperately, confronted the vagaries of his nomadic existence, only late in life reconciling himself to his sense that there were no final answers. It might be an overstatement that words were his last resort, but he certainly did not abstain from turning to them if he thought they could increase his chances of accessing deeper meanings hard to convey by means of images. Like many other visual artists, he gave his works suggestive titles, incorporated words into his paintings, scribbled on the backside of his canvases or frames, and wrote companion pieces, discursive or poetic. Some of his most profound and revealing poems are those in which he celebrates the mysterious and paradoxical power of language, showing that words tease us to believe that with them we can fully and truthfully record and convey to others our perceptions, thoughts, and emotions. But in the end, they so often undermine our confidence in language, leaving us helpless and speechless in the face of the unutterable and indescribable. The biggest difficulty with fully appreciating Hartley's probing inquiries is that when he delves into speculations about the nature of artistic expression and its limits, one of the most frequent themes in his essays and letters, he takes the whole field of creative imagination and experience into consideration, and rather than contemplating different media's merits and confines, he raises all-embracing questions that he thinks address issues equally relevant for all artists and writers. The contacts he maintained were broad and the books he read were diverse, but his lack of intellectual discipline combined with his excessive predilection towards spiritual concerns sometimes upset his desired equilibrium between idea and experience. When that happened, he tried to mitigate the imbalance by ascertaining that art, quote, art is not a comfortable or an emotional issue, but a stimulating intellectual one, end of quote. On the whole, over time, his best poems fared much better than his discursive texts, which today are mostly of interest to experts. By contrast to many of his essays' convoluted and muddled logic and stilted and over-emotional diction, the casual conversational tone of his best poems can be easily appreciated by the contemporary reader. And this quality of Hartley's verse has been praised by several important poets of the post-World War II generation, notably by Allen Ginsberg, who listed Hartley as one of his major influences next to Pound and Williams. In a class on free-form poetry he once taught, he introduced Hartley as, quote, one of the most loose, relaxed, and straightforward natural poets that ever wrote in this form. And he then cited an example which, according to him, accomplishes something that Stiglitz was looking for and Williams was looking for: indigenous American evidence. What kind of mentality? What kind of culture? What kind of psyche? What kind of God? What kind of dreams? What kind of politics? What kind of tragedy? What kind of strike breaking? What kind of closet clean homosexuality in the small town would the teacher thought what we lived like, rather than imitating a foreign model? Perhaps the breadth of Ginsberg's reading is slightly exaggerated, but his enthusiasm for what he calls an exemplary embodiment of the notion of sacred America that Whitman proposed is genuine and relevant. It highlights the same quality that many art historians and critics single out when describing Hartley's achievement and impact as a painter. Clement Greenberg, the foremost champion of the New York School of Abstract Expressionism, wrote this about Hartley in 1950. Perhaps he anticipated the present mood of American art more clearly than any other American artist of his time. His works have an intensity and are animated by a desire to break through to a fresh and direct reality of pictorial feeling that bring them close somehow to the most recent abstract paintings. So one can only speculate how Hartley's writing would have been affected had he broken through to a fully abstract language in painting. As a visual artist, he had perfect intuition, which allowed him to achieve a sense of harmonious union with colors and shapes. But in writing, especially in his poetry, he all too often surrendered to the anxiety of influence. On rare occasions, when he was able to strike a balance between emotions and intuition on the one hand, and intellect and insight on the other, his words fell into place, becoming indispensable elements of a larger whole, a vision that is captivating and convincing because, as poetry Marjorie Perloff puts it, language, quote, far from being merely a vehicle or conduit for thoughts and feelings outside and prior to it, is itself the site of meaning making, end of quote. Had Stiglitz been able and willing to recognize as worth promoting the underrated literary and intellectual talents and ambitions of all his artists, perhaps he would have also offered his patronage to Man Ray. Undeterred by Stiglitz's polite but explicit indifference to his attempts at modernist painting, the young artist steadily expanded the scope of his explorations in hopes of discovering his true métier beyond what he always wanted to do, and that was paint. By the time he found his forte in photography, he had also established a close relationship with another artist, newly arrived in America from France, Marcel Duchamp, already well known to the American public because of the artistic scandal his nude descending a staircase had caused at the Armory Show 2 years earlier. The two almost instantly became the avant-garde's most famous soul and mind brothers, the yin-yang of American Dada. In the summer of 1920, Duchamp decided to return to France, and it only took a few weeks for Man Ray to follow. He found in Paris a hospitable environment, quickly winning the hearts and minds of local bohemians and patrons, and becoming a celebrated fashion photographer. His inventiveness, wit, and charm endeared him to the media, wealthy patrons, and the leading figures of the international bohemia. But, like in New York, the one kind of success he really craved, recognition of his painting, continued to elude him. And this paradox overshadows another equally paradoxical aspect of his wide-ranging creative accomplishments. On the one hand, he may be the most recognizable of 20th century photographers. I'm sure you know this photograph. And one of the most widely read representatives of his generation of artists. His autobiography, Self-Portrait, has remained in print since its first publication in 1963 and has been translated into several major languages. At the same time, despite its popularity, his other literary endeavors have for decades been regarded as mere Dadaist jokes, clever but trifling. What critics stubbornly failed to notice and acknowledge is that Man Ray was a versatile artist with an unusually high and acute awareness of the nature of artistic creativity, and understood better than many the expressive power of works of art, that the expressive power of works of art is directly related to the unique, one can call them signature, characteristics of the medium at hand, which determines more than anything else what the artist can express. He was particularly fascinated by the power of language to both accurately record perceptual and mental experience and autonomously enhance and enrich it in ways that are surprising and revelatory. From early on, he was an avid reader of books, and as he matured as an artist, the need in him kept growing to properly identify and catalog the successive stages of the evolution of his theoretical and practical ideas about art making. He was only 25 when he published an essay titled The Conscious Individual, in which he emphatically stated, with the authoritativeness of a much more experienced artist, that, quote, art is man's simplest concrete expression of his greatest intellectual experience, end of quote. In later years, however, he often spoke about his work with Dadaist frivolity, in this way contributing to the public perception of himself as a lightweight artist. Similarly to Hartley, the poet, Man Ray, the painter, was at once full of doubt and uncertainty and hungry for other people's approval and praise. When such recognition was not forthcoming, he frequently belittled his other accomplishments. For instance, he asserted that he hated photography and of his literary skills said that words have never been his true forte. He wrote his autobiography in a rather conventional narrative style, producing a book that makes for engaging and easy reading, but is neither ambitious enough to be considered great literature, nor historically accurate and detailed enough to be a valuable source for historians. And yet, more perceptive critics were for years puzzled by the discrepancy between the absence of deeper scholarly interest in his other writings and the well-documented respect with which the most important representatives of the avant-garde always spoke about his contributions to the idea of the modern. The roster includes, besides Duchamp, also the main Dada and Surrealist poets and writers from Tristan Tzara to André Breton, who wrote enthusiastic introductions for catalogs of Man Ray's exhibitions. The thing is that for a very long time, Man Ray's diverse texts remained unknown, scattered in esoteric publications, and thus practically unavailable to researchers and interested readers. And they were finally collected and published in Writings on Art only 5 years ago, at long last bringing to light a completely new dimension of this legend, a story of a profound and sharp thinker and a talented original writer. Man Ray's interest and dedication to poetry played a role in his decision to marry a young Belgian poet who introduced him to Francophone literature. Among their closest friends were several writers with whom Man Ray started a literary magazine called The Glebe. And one of the issues went down in history as the first ever anthology of imagist poetry. Looking at language as a visual artist, he explored the compatibility and mutual equivalency of words and images, designing fonts and typography for his own poems. He often employed literary categories when talking about his paintings and used visual metaphors in his verses. In one of them, a poem titled Hieroglyphics, he compares a snowy landscape to the whiteness of the page and human figures to the shapes of letters. And he called his amorphous and semantically indeterminate ready-mades and collages plastic poems. He highlighted their sensual and conceptual crypticalness by attaching to them short poetic vignettes, sometimes simply funny in their literalness and sometimes quite enigmatic, all intended as notes pretending to explain the work, but not really doing that. Instead, adding themselves to the objects that were supposed to name and enlighten without establishing any logical connection with them. Contrary to the work he did in the darkroom, which he compared to a coal mine, or dealing with the sticky medium of paint, he always declared that writing gave him sheer pleasure. He took writing as a serious undertaking, even when he was talking about things merry or funny, often repeating after Duchamp that the exercise of gray matter should not only entertain, but also stimulate the intellect. As a pragmatic thinker, he considered writing as the best way of taking stock of one's perceptions and reflections instantaneously. In his unpublished novel titled 1944, he notes the satisfaction he derived from observing the transformation of ink and thought into words, with all their attendant doubt and confusion. Man Ray's texts often rely on free play of the imagination, which means, as he puts it, that the most unrelated ideas, I'm quoting, the most unrelated ideas can finally, by a long association, become kindred and even seem inseparable and indispensable to each other, end of quote. He not only had a keen eye for shapes, including those of letters, but an equally keen ear, uniquely sensitive to the most subtle rhythmic and sounding patterns and correspondences, such as assonance, homophony, and alliteration. He collected proverbs, witticisms, and puns, which he transformed into hilarious double entendres, brilliant anagrams, and amusingly nonsensical aphorisms. Reflecting on the nature of verbal communication, Man Ray invoked his own experiences with native speakers of language other than English. So a few anecdotes. On one occasion, he wrote this to Gertrude Stein: "It's simple enough to learn a language, but to make oneself understood." He knew what he was talking about, for having settled in Paris like she had before him, he had to learn French to be able to communicate with the locals. But he also knew from past experience that kindred spirits do not need any language at all to communicate. In his autobiography, he thus describes his first meeting with the composer Erik Satie. Introducing himself as Erik Satie, he relapsed into French, which I informed him I didn't understand. With a twinkle in his eye, he said, it didn't matter. Indirectly, the anecdote alludes to another historic event, Man Ray's first encounter with Duchamp. That's, of course, a later photograph. They met at a picnic arranged by mutual friends and immediately found common ground in an impromptu make-believe game of tennis they played on the grass. Acting in the double capacity of player cum umpire, Man Ray scrupulously called the strokes in order to make conversation. Duchamp, who was only beginning to acquire his first English words, each time confirmed the score with one word: yes, yes. Unlike Man Ray, Duchamp wrote sporadically and sparsely. But when he did, he produced texts as radically subversive of conventional literary composition as his anti-art. Both conveyed the same message. Retinal perception of forms created by the artist does not automatically produce aesthetic experience if it is not accompanied by the intellectual act of reflection on the phenomenal nature of art. To provoke and express this awareness, the artist must continuously conceptualize and reconceptualize the idea of art itself, questioning and debunking outdated notions. Duchamp is almost universally credited with being the first to once and for all delegitimize mimetism, art as imitation of life, as he ostentatiously gave up, at least officially, the practice of making Dadaist objects, by default devoid of any meaning and purpose. Jasper Johns, by many considered the most important American painter living today, described his key accomplishment in this way, quote, "He moved his work through the retinal boundaries, which had been established with Impressionism, into a field where language, thought, and vision act upon one another." End of quote. I can conclude my discussion by returning to the Stiglitz circle courtesy of Duchamp. He was never a member of the group, but in a historic move, he had Stiglitz take a photograph of one of his most famous works, Fountain, in front of a Marsden Hartley painting. This photograph may be the first instance of what is perhaps Duchamp's greatest legacy, not the destruction of art, but its elevation to a different level, the level of thought and vision, where the creation of a material object is merely a pretext to the story that follows. For the original urinal seen in this photograph no longer exists, having disappeared in circumstances that were never ascertained. It has existed ever since as a concept, a crude ready-made put on a pedestal reserved for works of art and then removed from it, only to be replicated by licensed craftsmen as original copies of the original, signed by the author. The author of what? Of the idea, which exists only as such, with Stiglitz's photograph as proof where and when it came into being. Art based on and essentially reduced to the idea and its documentation, whether in pictures or in words, is of course what conceptualism is chiefly about. It came of age while Duchamp was still present on the art scene as the godfather. The challenge that his ideas posed often exceeded the adaptive capabilities of audiences accustomed and attached to aesthetic standards sanctioned by tradition and history. Luckily, artists who drew influence from Duchamp, and it seems fair to say that practically all important innovators in the second half of the 20th century did so, accept that when we have no grounds for excluding anything, there is no longer any special way a work of art has to look. This raises the question if the meaning of art can be taught by examples anymore. It is a puzzling question which compels many artists to systematically expound and justify their new ideas and practices. This, to me, is the principal reason why the modernist revolution started over a century ago with the eruption of literary proclivities and talents among the artists themselves, resulting in the appearance of unprecedented numbers of manifestos, treatises on art, critical and speculative essays, autobiographies, biographies, journals, memoirs, creative writing in verse and prose, and all kinds of other generically unclassifiable texts penned by practicing painters, sculptors, and others defining themselves as writing artists rather than writers with artistic inclinations. It was not really all that surprising that so many of them, with great ease, adapted and adopted language and various discursive forms to prove that art is always the result of engaging gray matter too, in response to external sensual and internal mental stimuli. So I would say that art is what makes the artist think, before, during, and after the creative act, and sometimes instead of it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I am absolutely, blown away and delighted. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're too kind.
No, I'm very happy because kind of like I'm also interested in American visual art. I also publish texts about it, and and we've been to conferences together, and we know that so few people do it, right? Not only in Poland, I think that it's a limited number of people, definitely. And another thing is that this semester I'm teaching a class on the history of American art, and some of the paintings that you've shown us, I also show my students in my classes. So I am also so very happy for them that that hopefully they were able to make connections between your talk and our classes, and kind of like see and feel that knowing those paintings and knowing about the painting, it makes sense, okay, because then they can enjoy other things, and that art is relevant, okay. It is not like an island somewhere, but there is a lot, right? There are lots of links between the practice of life and art. So many thanks for this. I can see that we don't have that much time, but we have some time for questions or maybe comments. So I encourage all of you. I'm looking at the chat box, and I don't see any questions here. So would anybody like to say anything at this point? Ask a question, maybe comment, maybe like share your thoughts or impressions, please. You're very welcome to do so. I cannot hear you, Eva. Yes, now it's perfect. Okay.
Edyta, thank you so very much. Especially, the second part was extremely interesting, really inspirational. I have a question about, one of the names that you left out, in your analysis of modernism. You were making associations with the changing paradigm, okay? And, when you were delving, yes, into that change, the artist is being perceived, yes? And you were, giving us that insight a little bit into progressivism, into the changing status of science. Yet one name that you left out is that of Nietzsche, in his way of thinking about art. Yes. My question is, when you talk about the Stiglitz circle, where would you put Nietzsche in all this? When he talks about the science of art. So he's actually the one that challenges that division, between art as intuition, emotion, something, Kantian. Yes.
I would go back to Kant even.
Yes, notion of art, yes.
Shows that the issue of aesthetics, art, emotions, intellect, imagination, has been part of this ongoing discussion. I mean, we could go back to ancient times. With Nietzsche, I don't know, Eva, if you are familiar with any texts or discussions by American artists from that time of Nietzsche. Are you? So I would
yes,
like to
absolutely. Yes, this is my question. I think that Nietzsche would be the key influence here. When you read Nietzsche's, for example, Human All Too Human, he talks about the science of art, challenges, the assumption that and that the notion of that inspirational art, and hence the art that that there is a like a break between the intellectual and the artistic. And he challenges that. He says, art is basically like science. He and he does use that notion of science, and this is exactly him responding to the growth of sciences you put your finger in this. And I think it's a turning point for the whole intellectual community, artists including.
It definitely is. Although that's why I ask you, Eva, if you are familiar with any actual thoughts put down by American artists on Nietzsche, because I'm not familiar with any of them. Although, of course, what they do is exactly what Nietzsche suggests. And also, I would say that if you look at artists from that time, they would, or slightly later, they were fascinated with Henri Bergson, who would say that intuition is a form of science too.
Yes.
So it all comes together, definitely, even if you don't really have artists talking about Nietzsche. I mean, there were certain continental names that were more popular for some reason with American artists at the time than others. But well, that's a very interesting link you're making. I can't see what Justyna has written concerning. She has put something down. Anti-intellectual, putting the Dionysian before the Apollonian. Yes. So,
excuse me. I just want to say that I think that Nietzsche, when he said science, he meant something else that we say when we talk about sciences, meaning like physics.
Nietzsche is
like
also changing his understanding of science.
Absolutely,
a shift. At the beginning, this is actually his first essay that he publishes, and then he moves into a little bit different understanding of science. But basically, yes, it is a response to what is happening, scientifically at that time. And definitely he doesn't talk about, science as a compilation of facts, if this is what we are talking about, but he's talking about exactly another faculty of the mind being used, being at work. Yes, when we produce art, then traditionally, it was believed that it's used while composing art.
So it's, Eva, you're right. It's definitely part of thinking that, of course, Nietzsche is, in a way, is a pioneer in this, although we can go back, as I said, back to antiquity, thinking about, those differences. That's absolutely what characterizes thinking about art at the turn of the century. Late 19th century, early 20th century is definitely there. And I think it's very interesting also in the present context, what happens, with the affect studies, affective turn, where is thinking, where is intelligence, where is intellect in all that? And all the latest philosophical discussions about, discussions that again have been going for forever. Where does the imagination come from? There is creative power. Where exactly does it take us, right? So yes, thank you for this comment. I just, I'm not that well read, although I read so many American artists' texts. I don't recall really any of those that, definitely not the ones that I have presented. You will not find Nietzsche, but his ideas, right? Yes, but I don't think you can.
Even Stiglitz circles the idea of an artist, as a critic that also, is a kind of an intellectual leader, that resonates, with Nietzschean ideas. So you have actually the translation, everybody at that time was reading Nietzsche, you mentioned writers, you mentioned poets here, everybody, it was a must.
Of course, they exchanged those ideas, definitely.
So that actually Stiglitz himself, I think there, it was written about this, he was very much inspired by Nietzsche, but it's just something that was missing. I was thinking that's a certain paradigm, and actually it's a bigger question. What is the extent to which his ideas affected that community, and what is the other way around? That community was ready for the reception of those ideas, and it was ready because of the social and economic paradigm that you actually mentioned, because you mentioned, for example, progressivism. And we could talk about Taylorism. Yes, so this is the spreading of the ideas of an expert. Yes, of a critic being an expert, so also an expert on his art. So that's part of my question. But maybe
Well, you got me thinking, Eva. Thank you for that. I will look into it, definitely. Yes, and also Justyna added Freud here. When I think about the Stiglitz circle, it's Freud and Bergson. And Havelock Ellis, his studies into sexual life. So it's more in this direction. This is who they discuss. Of course, they.
By the way, Freud is building on Nietzsche.
And so that's the link, that's the connection. There you go. Right. Although they read Freud in a very superficial level at the beginning. So, they take what they need for that. I mean, Stiglitz, what he needs for his particular version of what this great American thing should be. Yes, what they should be looking for. So it's, but it's a fascinating topic. And I think we could have a separate lecture on this. Thank you.
Yes, okay. It's a big and complex thing. So I think that now people may be shy to ask questions, like smaller questions, but let's see. Would anybody like to ask another question? Hello, students, maybe, one of you also, or maybe shy, professor, please. No, this is the difficulty, right, with the black squares.
I'm afraid I have overwhelmed you with all that.
I think so, right? I have so many notes. For example, one of the things that struck me simply was that I never thought about Georgia O'Keeffe as a Platonic. And then, when I listened to and I saw the quotations that you showed us, right, about the getting rid of details, right, they are confusing and we have to get to the essence of things, right? I never thought about her in that way, right? That this is, as if she was, through searching for the right form and executing, right, the things, in the image, as if she was searching, for the purification of all the confusion, and the noise and the details and, searching for the simplified forms, right? I kind of like, now it seems to me obvious, but it was illuminating to me, right, when I saw the quote.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how in her case, this burden is sort of double. I mean, not only is she an artist in a society that is not really understanding of art and artists, but also she's a woman. So in her case, it's a more convoluted thing, and she really hides so much of what interests her, of what she does other than painting, or even in painting. I mean, many of her choices were influenced by Stiglitz, particularly in the first phase of her career, where she was, well, you cannot paint this, you cannot paint skyscrapers. It's not good for a woman. So on the one hand, you have that openness. We need a woman icon. We put her on a pedestal. But on the other, there's the role that is prescribed to her, definitely.
Right, and how she wants to stay away from the body, right? If you have anything that has to do with the body, it's only bones, right? Like, the painting which you showed us, pelvis, right? Pelvis, which is connected with, like sex and reproduction, and like this stuff, right? And then it is all void. And if you juxtapose it with this quote from Stiglitz, right, that the woman paints with her womb, like she paints, right? It's like, this extremely, I don't know, like both, there is tragedy in it, right? That all you have are bones, and this empty space and the wind blowing through the bones. And it's called pelvis.
It's what's fascinating is that so definitely in case of O'Keeffe and Hartley, you can read their art as coded messages.
Absolutely.
Only, which is only supported by what comes through in their writings.
Yeah.
Or not only content-wise, but also, what they do with those writings, how they put those thoughts into words. So there is a very interesting link there, definitely.
Yes, yes. Okay, Domenico, would you like to say it, or should I?
She has to run to switch over to.
Okay. So yes, we have to finish.
I was hoping for questions from people in affect studies, because I place so much here on cognitive faculties of artists. Well, we have no time.
Yeah, I think, I just feel that, all of it is complex and very difficult, that maybe it would require some, pre-preparation, right? Like reading something or thinking about something ahead of the presentation, because it's been so rich, simply put. So people, would anybody like to say something, right, by way of, like a concluding remark, please? Anya? Yeah, oh yes. Pani Anastasio, please.
I just want to say generally thank you. It was very interesting, as Professor Wierzchowska noted, very complex. But as I'm very interested in feminist art, and I've kind of been noticing, because I'm still very young in all of this, I'm trying to learn, but I've been noticing this more abstract art in both like feminine genres. And I even say this quote that you presented to us today, 1 second, that nothing is less real than realism. Details are confusing. And I found it as well that abstract art is more appealing to emotions. So you kind of gave all this food for thought, and thank you so much. I'm just going to continue learning all of that. Well, it's so beautiful how you explained all of this and put it in more simple terms to understand, and all these paintings. And also, yeah, it's linked to what we've been covering on the lectures of Sztuce Amerykańskiej with Professor Wierzchowska. It was really nice to recognize some of the paintings and not be confused at all.
Wonderful. So is the course you're taking on 1 semester? Is it a 1 semester course? Oh yeah, so not enough time, Justyna. I know your pain. You would like to share more with students, I'm sure.
Yeah, but I'm happy that we have it, right? It's good to have it, and so I'm happy with that.
Thank you, Anastasia, for your comment. Very lovely.
Okay. Anybody else? Anything else, please? I know we have to finish. Yeah, we have to finish, right?
And I think that Edyta's presentation was a wonderful sort of synthesized survey of what you're teaching, right? So it will help the students remember better 1 semester course. And
well, I kept in mind what you told me, that there are students who are the audience most of all. So I hope everybody will take a little bit of what I have said today for themselves to think about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think on all different levels, right? Like anything which deals with modernism, right? Not only visual art, but also literature, philosophy, right? You did a lot of philosophy. I teach philosophy. So, I was also happy about that. We need to finish. I am so very sorry, right, everybody. I hope that you, enjoyed it. I hope that you take away stuff in your notes, in your heads, in your bodies. So thank you for being here with us. Thank you once again, Edyta, for this. And well, see you next time, and many, many times. And have a good day. Stay safe, and see you again, right? And again. Thank you, everybody, and bye-bye.